Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the fifth installment of the video cheat sheet for 4 Group. As always, I'll be providing you and your 4 Group a few talking points for you to discuss as you meet, and hopefully you're finding all this helpful. I'm going to give you a couple of talking points to discuss in the upcoming week's sermon to get you ready for what you'll hear. You can discuss what you think the sermon will be about and then let the pastor clear it up for you after you actually hear the sermon, okay? Then I'll provide a few talking points for those of you going through emotionally healthy spirituality. This week, I'll be discussing chapter 5, and that chapter is entitled, Enlarge Your Soul Through Grief and Loss, okay? Let's first begin with the sermon, which is the last installment in a series entitled Life Together, Studies of 2 Timothy. This week's sermon is entitled Engage with Community, okay? And the passage from which the sermon is pulled is 2 Timothy 4, 9 to 22. 2 Timothy 4, 9 to 22. So you want to read that before your group gets together. And what you're going to notice right away when you start reading this is that, at least at first pass, it doesn't seem to be full of too much. There doesn't seem to be a lot there. And as you might know, it's an ending to a letter. In other words, most letters contain specific elements or specific components to them. It has a greeting, it has a main body, and a salutation or conclusion. And the portion of the letter that we're reading here from Paul to Timothy is the conclusion, the sign-off. Now, you might ask yourself, of what value is that? Why would we study that? Well, there's a whole lot going on here that you might not be aware of. Remember, we're discussing life together. So what's the point we're trying to make here in the midst of reading this conclusion that Paul is writing to Timothy? Paul mentions a lot of people in this conclusion. If you've got some extra time, you might want to try and do some digging and figure out why he's mentioning some of the people he's mentioning, and then try and figure out the takeaway. But let me give you a hint of one of them. Let me show you one of them. He specifically mentions Mark. Now, why is Mark significant? Why is it significant that he brings up Mark? If you read Acts 15, look at the end of that chapter, the end of Acts 15. Here's what it says about Paul and Barnabas, beginning in verse 39. Okay, Acts 15, 39 and 40. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. A sharp disagreement, it says. A sharp disagreement which Mark found himself in the middle of. He took off with Barnabas. Mark and Barnabas took off. And it says Paul chose Silas, right? Not Mark. So do you see why it's important that Paul mentions him in 2 Timothy? When he wrote 2 Timothy, he was near the end of his life. So this is after, he and Barnabas and Mark departed from one another. And here he says to Timothy, get Mark, bring him with you. He's very useful to me. See that? Here's at least one thing Christian community teaches us that we read from this salutation, or this conclusion. Through community, we learn the love of Christ that joins our hearts to others and moves us past personal conflict. Whatever conflict that existed between Paul and Mark, it seems as though they've buried the hatchet. That comes by way of Christian community. All right? So you get through each of these names that Paul is listing in this conclusion of the letter and see where else most of them are mentioned in the New Testament, and see how Paul has made it thus far to where he is. Who has supported him along the way? It's these people that he's mentioning. And in each instance, if you look up each name and try and find where else they appear in the New Testament, you'll see significant events where the church has held him up. He was held up by the structure that is community, that God put around him, the people and community that God put around him. But listen, it's not just big events. It's not just big events. That's what this scripture is showing us. It's not just big events. He leans on the church for the ordinary, the mundane, everyday things, like he mentioned specifically, bring my coat. I need a coat. And some books and some parchments that he really would like to get his hands on too. So what place does community play in the life of a Christian? Every place. Every place, from the mundane to the ultra significant. Okay, so your talking point. What's your talking point? Talk about the value of Christian community, which if you're gathered as a 4 Group, you're off to a great start. But talk about its value and why it's so easy to neglect, and why it's so important that we don't do that. Okay, talk about that, the value of Christian community and why it's so easy to neglect and it's so important that we don't. Okay, let's move on. Chapter 5 of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Enlarge your soul through grief and loss. I'd like to start by quoting the first sentence of the chapter because it's so important you realize this as you journey in your faith. He says, there is no greater disaster in the spiritual life than to be immersed in unreality. In fact, the true spiritual life is not an escape from reality, but an absolute commitment to it. That's hard to hear sometimes. Why is that important? Because there's this misconception out there that when you enter into a relationship with Jesus Christ, if you do as he says and you do all the things that he commands, then your life will be smooth sailing from there. Friends, I hope you know that can't be further from the truth. In fact, your journey in the Christian faith guarantees that there will be struggle. Guarantees it. But it also guarantees that you'll not ever be alone in those struggles. Loss and grief will be a part of your struggles. You will have to deal with loss and struggle. You may be dealing with that right now. You will lose your youth. You will lose your dreams. You will lose your stability. You will lose, I hope you don't, but I bet you will face catastrophic loss at some point. But also the author says, we'll lose our wrong ideas of God and the church too. It's not the perfect family that we once expected when we first came to it. So here in this chapter, we're learning a lot of how to deal with loss in a biblically healthy manner. He outlines for us the typical reasons we have, he outlines the typical reactions that we have to loss, those being denial, minimizing, blaming others, blaming yourself, rationalizing, intellectualizing, distracting, and becoming hostile. And again, if you've ever dealt with catastrophic loss, reactions like those are pretty common. So how do we deal with loss in a biblically and healthy manner? He examines how Job reacted to his catastrophic loss. You remember Job, in a matter of hours, Job lost everything, his children, his land, his health, everything. His friends came to him and told him to curse God and die. Some friends, right? So what did Job do? Which as an aside, you should know, Job is just an Old Testament shadow picture of Jesus. It's a free bonus. But anyway, what did Job do? First, we're told he paid attention. And then we're told he waited. And then we're told he embraced the gift of limits. And you can review what each of these means. The author goes into a great bit of detail on what each of those means. But then, and this is the one I think you should focus on, then, as the author says, he climbed the ladder of humility. Climbing the ladder of humility. And it's a great place to pull your talking points. And as I said, I think a couple weeks ago, in my opinion, the secret sauce to Christianity is humility. So, pull out the ladder of humility in this chapter. There's 8 steps. And have a discussion of which steps are the most difficult for you. Which ones are you better at, but which ones need work? Focus on that, and I'm sure that will provide plenty of discussion. Look through those, because again, humility, it's a secret sauce to Christianity. The basis of this chapter lies in the idea that we've got to learn to die to self. This is what humility is, dying to self. Put to death the expectations we had for life. It's okay to mourn. It's okay to grieve those losses. In fact, it's good. It's good to do that, okay? As he notes, there's an entire book of the Bible devoted to, and Scott has said this before too, to complaints, right? Lamentations. And that's a good thing. But embracing God's design over ours, dying to self, right? And waking to him, this will help us deal with grief and loss in a way that probably we're not typically accustomed to doing. So there you go. I hope that's helpful. Once again, keep going, stick with it, continue investing in one another. We do need each other, so keep it up, okay? God bless you. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.